Hi, students. My name is Dr. Jessica Purcell, and I'm here for your career fair representing the career of a biologist. And specifically, I happen to be a professor of entomology, which means that I do biological research on insects, and I also teach university courses and do university service. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I actually do, what my job entails. I'll spend some time telling you about just a little bit of my research and why I wanted to be a researcher, a biology researcher. And then I'll tell you about my background and the steps that it took to get to where I am today. And so when you picture a biologist or a scientist or a professor, oftentimes people kind of jump to the conclusion that, this might be an older person, a person with gray hair, potentially a male person. And I'm here to tell you that professors in all fields and increasingly in science, we are more and more diverse. And if this sounds like a career for you, there's no reason that you shouldn't pursue it. So a lot of people wonder what I actually do as a professor of entomology. And to be completely honest, most people assume that this is predominantly a teaching position. And in my case, that's not true. So I do teach and I really enjoy teaching, but it's really not the majority of my job. So most of my time is spent working on research. So I'm researching totally new ideas and questions that other people haven't looked into before. And this is actually my favorite part of the job. It's discovering things that nobody knew and figuring out how things work and putting them into terms that my colleagues and the public can understand. So expanding the knowledge of society in terms of how the natural world works. And I love this part. And I also love passing that enthusiasm and knowledge along to my students. And really, my job is broken down into 3 different categories. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each of them. So I tell you this because, like I said, there's this common misconception that the majority of a professor's job is teaching, and that's a really important part of the job, but it's far from all of it. So my research actually includes overseeing and doing experiments and observational research. So going out, like this picture shows me out in the Alps where I've just caught an ant queen which will be the subject of some of my research. I spend time doing that, but I also train future researchers. So I have graduate students and undergraduate college students who work with me and learn the ropes of doing scientific research. The actual research that I do, it involves some field work. This is field work. So you go out into the world and you try to find the organisms that you're interested in and learn about what they're doing. I also do a lot of genetics. So I have a lab at the university where we actually extract genetic material, DNA, and we can sequence that DNA and try to understand what genes control the traits that we're interested in, for example. My teaching actually includes about 2 classes per year. And these, I also happen to really love teaching. So I actually bring a group of students with me to do research in Switzerland where I teach them about insect ecology. So this is me teaching insect ecology in Switzerland. So I teach regular classes and I also mentor students. So like I said, with research, I'm not only doing research myself, but I'm training the next generation of researchers. And finally, and the courses that I teach, just so that you know, I teach a course in evolutionary biology to students who aren't majoring in sciences. I teach a graduate student course in ecology and genetics, and I teach insect ecology in Switzerland, where we actually take most of our classes outside and practice different techniques. Finally, a big part of my job is also what I call service. And this means like I'm serving on committees at the university. I'm helping students who aren't my own mentees succeed. I also I participate in the broader scientific community. So I serve as an editor on some scientific journals, and I also provide peer review services. So I read other people's papers before they're published, and I provide my opinion about the things that they're doing well and the things that could be improved. So the job, there's a lot going on all the time, and it kind of keeps it interesting, but it can also be a little bit overwhelming when you have a lot to do. And so, yeah, some of the perks and drawbacks of being a professor and a biology researcher, I would say some of the biggest perks are I get to travel. I happen to study ants that live in places that look like this. So I get to go look for those ants in these beautiful places and enjoy being outside. I've been able to travel all over the world, and that's been remarkable. Another thing that I really love is being able to basically make my own job in a way. So I choose what questions my lab studies. I get to choose what kind of science we do, what our main goals are. And I really like that kind of freedom. I'm a very curious person, and I love being able to figure out what I want to study and build my research, the research side of my job around that. I get to interact with phenomenal people. So the students that I've had, my colleagues, people that I've met around the world, I just feel so fortunate to get to meet and interact with all of these really great people. And I also, like I said earlier, I just love teaching. So I really enjoy teaching, but for me personally, I enjoy teaching as part of my broader job. And I like being able to do a mix of things because it keeps it very interesting for me. Some drawbacks. This is an example of my current to-do list for this week. So there's just always more to do than you can possibly achieve. It's really hard to get everything done. And then while there's a lot of tasks that I really enjoy in my job, of course, there's things that I don't like to do, I think like with any job. So it's not all getting to spend time in a place like this. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you about my particular research interest. And I will say that this isn't the hallmark of a biologist. This is just, my particular interests and curiosity drove me in the direction of wanting to understand why we see some insect and spider groups that cooperate together, they work together, and others that don't. Others that are solitary, they always live alone, or if they do interact, it's usually aggressive fighting. I want to tell you a little bit more as well about my own actual research and what I've done, so what I've contributed to our understanding of the natural world. And I'm just going to tell you about one single example of how societies respond to emergencies. So this is another example of a potential benefit of cooperation. And this isn't one of my most important studies, in my opinion, but I think it's my most fun study. So I'm going to walk you through it. And the emergency that we're talking about here is actually the flooding of a riverbed where there's ants living. And so it turns out, as you know, many ants live underground. And if there's a flood near their nests, a lot of different ant species can actually work together and use their bodies to build these floating platforms. So working with a team of other researchers, mostly students, we formulated a couple of research questions. So we wanted to know whether the workers, the brood, which represent the babies, so ants, like butterflies, have a larval stage when they're young. So they look very different from the adults. So what happens to the workers, the brood, and the queens, who are the individuals in the nest that are responsible for reproducing? Where are they positioned? And then do ants seek positions to optimize self-preservation or the protection of others? So in other words, are they cooperating to the point where some individuals are sacrificing themselves for the good of the rest of the colony? Or is there some other mechanism that goes along with the assembly of the raft? And so I did this study with several students, but the most involved student was named Amaury Avril. I actually did this while I lived in Switzerland. And working together, we were able to pull together a really interesting experimental design. So one thing that I love about being a biologist is that I don't just get to be a biologist. So in building this experiment, I actually had to think like an engineer. I had to build a structure that I could have in my lab where I could actually watch what the ants were doing from above and below while simulating a flood. So Amaury and I came up with some ideas, and finally we were able to build these boxes that had glass islands in the middle where we would put the ants. So the ants would start out on this glass island, and then we could film them with cameras from above and below so we could see what was happening at the top and at the bottom. And we gradually raised the water level like it would happen in real life. And we did this using an IV drip, so like what you could get at a hospital if you were dehydrated. All right, so what did we find out? Let me show you a couple of cool videos. So this is the name of the species, and we're actually going to be filming from below. These are larvae. So these are like the equivalent of caterpillars and ants. They're the babies. And these particular ones are ultimately going to be queens. So they are very expensive to produce. And I've sped up this film so you can see that the ants are moving kind of quickly. But what happens absolutely shocked us. All of the workers jump on top of the larvae, the babies, and they float away. So we thought, well, what's happening there? That's crazy. And we carried out a few additional experiments. Now I'm going to show you one other video of what happens to the queens. So this is a video filmed from above of a colony where the workers have 2 of their queens present. So some ant colonies have more than 1 queen. This one had 2. You can see that the queens are there. We're filming from above. So as the water level rises, the workers are rushing around, and they're kind of coming back, checking in with the queens. And just as the water level reaches the group, the workers will actually raise the queens up, and the queens end up in a ball of ants. So they have workers below them and workers above them, and they're protected from all sides. So they're protected from the water below, but also from potential predators that might be looking for an easy snack from above. So I'll just show you the outcome of this by forwarding ahead. So you see it's a very tight ball all around those queens, and then they float just fine. And we had painted some of these ants so that we could keep track of where they were in the raft. Okay, so we actually wanted to figure out what are the costs and the benefits of the positioning of those brood items. So these larvae that are ultimately that are going to become queens or males. These are the babies of the colony. So we hypothesized, we predicted that maybe rafts that have those brood items on the bottom are able to recover more quickly. And so this is a risky time in their life. They're surviving a flood, they're responding to a flood, and they're hopefully surviving the flood. And it's the workers that do all of the work. So if they do reach dry land, they have to dig a new nest, they have to move all of the queens and the brood to safety. And so if the workers don't respond quickly, the colony might be lost. The colony might fail to survive. So we actually looked at the number of unresponsive workers, and we found that when there was brood present, all of the workers usually did very well and were able to, as soon as they reached dry land, they were able to start engaging in regular activities. But without brood, we found that many more of the workers were not responsive. So they didn't actually die. They did survive, but it took them a lot longer to recover from rafting. We also thought that perhaps the brood items were more buoyant, so they're better at floating than the workers. And this is because the brood are really, really full of fat. So they're being fed all the time, and they're very fatty. And so it turns out that that's true, but we actually tested this with a really simple trick. So we looked at the proportion of the individuals that were afloat after 30 minutes in just straight water. And here, actually, surprisingly, the workers and the brood float just fine. But then we challenged them with soapy water that decreases the surface tension. And so only things that are really buoyant are going to float in soapy water. And we thought that that would simulate moving water, which the ants would be experiencing. And so it turns out that the brood are extremely buoyant, and the workers are really not very buoyant at all. So the ants are using the most buoyant members of their society to build this raft. And finally, we asked, okay, well, how expensive is this really? How many of the brood are sacrificed to make this raft very buoyant and to allow the colony to recover quickly? And it turned out, when we compared the survival rate of larvae that had been used in the rafting experiment and larvae that were kept in the same conditions, but they weren't used in the rafting experiment, and the exact same survival rate. So it turns out that rafting, at least in our lab conditions, wasn't really costly at all. So the ants were able to use the characteristics of different members of their society in a very efficient way without sacrificing any of the individuals. So they really didn't pay a cost. And so this was kind of a neat discovery. It was very surprising to us, first, that they put the brood on the bottom, and then that we were able to show, actually, that makes perfect sense in this case. They're not sacrificing the brood, but they are taking advantage of their extreme buoyancy. So I've told you a lot about my research and a little bit about my job and the different components of my job. And now I'd like to just tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am, in case this type of job appeals to you. So like you, I went to public school. I'm originally from Massachusetts. I went to public school from kindergarten through 12th grade. And I had really wonderful teachers, and I got such great advice and great mentorship from my teachers. I'm so grateful for them. I then, when I graduated from high school, or before graduating from high school, I applied to college, and I got into my first choice, where I was able to pursue a bachelor's degree. I was so lucky to get the opportunity to work with some amazing professors. And I was at first afraid to talk to them, and I'm so glad that I decided to follow through and reach out to professors and ask for opportunities, because when I was an undergraduate, I got an opportunity to work on 2 different research projects, and I was paid for both of those. They were summer jobs. So the first one, I was investigating the spread of an invasive plant in a local forest, and I got to spend the whole summer outside, and I got paid for it. And I love the outdoors, so that was perfect for me. And then I got a chance to actually travel to a national park in the Great Lakes. It's an island called in Lake Superior called Isle Royal, where I carried out a research project on a species of frog that lives in little pools along the lakeshore. So that was a really amazing opportunity because I was able to travel with my professor and work very closely with him and learn a lot from him. I then took a break. I didn't want to continue straight into school. I'd been in school for a long time, and I wanted to have a chance to see the world. So I actually sought out research opportunities, and I was able to travel for a year to Bolivia and carry out research there. And there I studied a tree that lives very high up in the Andes Mountains. And then I was able to travel to Sweden and carry out another year of research there. I contacted people who were living and working in both of these places and said, "Hey, I've just graduated from university. I'm interested in opportunities." And in both cases, I was able to get some funding so that I was able to do this without going further into debt. So in Sweden, I actually did theoretical ecology. So I combined my interest in computer programming with biology, and I looked at why geese migrate on certain routes and not on other routes, but all using computer simulations. So those were pretty amazing opportunities, and I'm so grateful that I had a chance to live in such interesting and very different and unique places before I started my PhD work. For my PhD, so in order to be a biology professor, you have to get a PhD. But if you just want to do biology research, there's a lot of opportunities if you have a bachelor's degree, and even more if you have a master's degree. So there are opportunities out there, even if you don't want to go all the way through the PhD stage, but more often you're helping with a research project that's designed by somebody else. So by getting the PhD, I was able to start designing my own research projects and become more independent. So I did my PhD in Canada, but I was working on social spiders which live in the tropics. So every year I got to spend 3 months in South America, usually in Ecuador, but sometimes in Brazil, where I studied these guys. And as a PhD student, you actually design your own research. You carry out a series of research projects with mentorship from another professor. And you have an opportunity to start learning how to teach. So I also was able to teach and was paid throughout my PhD. I then got a postdoctoral fellowship to work in Switzerland. And there I switched from my work on spiders to working on ants. And I did that partly because ants are just everywhere and they're really easy to find and work with. And then finally in 2014, I was hired as a professor at UC Riverside, and I've been here ever since. So I'm going to end with just a few things that I wish I'd known or advice that I wish I'd gotten that I'd like to share with you. So whatever you decide to do, I think it's at your age, it's really important to identify your interests, think carefully about what you want to do, and try them. So try different things. And I did this myself. I pursued my hobbies when I was in high school and college. I volunteered at animal shelters, for example, and I really love animal husbandry, and that's still a big passion of mine. But I decided in doing that I wanted to keep that as a hobby instead of being my main job. So try different things, try them as volunteers. You can reach out to people who are doing the jobs that you want and ask about opportunities. Now, this is really scary to do because sometimes they're going to say, well, there aren't any opportunities yet. You have to wait. But that's really the worst thing that can happen. So if there's a job that you know you want to do and you're really excited about, find other people in your area who are doing that job and ask if you can shadow them, ask if they know of internship opportunities or volunteer opportunities that you can pursue to get a little bit of experience and see, do you really like that? Or is it something that you want to keep as a hobby? If people say no, keep on trying. The worst that happens is that they say no and you can try somebody else. I recommend joining clubs or going to events with people that share your interests. So the more that you talk to people, you may discover that there are whole fields and careers that you weren't even aware of, and that can open up doors. So that was certainly the case for me when I was an undergraduate. I had no idea that I could pursue biology research as a career. And I was so excited when I found out because this is really what I love to do. And then the last thing, and this is for further down the line, but if you decide that you like research or that you want to get a PhD in a field, it's important to know that you actually get paid for this. So we all know that going to university is very expensive, and it costs a lot to get that education. And so people kind of assume that it also costs a lot to get a master's degree or a PhD, but that doesn't have to be the case. There are great funding opportunities, especially in STEM, so in science and math and engineering. That's kind of where I'm coming from and where I am now. And I wish that I could see you in person, because normally I bring insects with me and we kind of hang out and talk about insects after this presentation. But this is the world that we live in right now. And so I hope that you've learned something. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me with those, and I'd be happy to answer.